You please come forward.
I'll do it.
If you don't mind, I think that Dr. Peter McPherson would like you to be closer.
We need an intimate discussion. We're going to have such a small group here. We can't do that.
Are we all ready to start? Hello? I would like to start the last panel, and I have this responsibility as a sponsor of the Inquirsity for this program. I should tell you what Inquirsity is all about, and then I will join the rest of the panel and discussion regarding the solutions. As I said in the beginning of the conference, I'm an entrepreneur. I like to see solutions and get things done. And I think you heard John thought we had forgotten about that. We used to call Vision Nations a do tank. That's not just a think tank, but getting it done tank. So from that perspective, I would like to suggest to you, focus on all these individuals who are going to propose some solutions to the higher education tsunami and what is the last mile in higher education. As we said earlier, it is the jobs and the lifetime prosperity of the student. Now, what is Inquirsity and why is Inquirsity sponsoring this event? Inquirsity came as my brainchild as a result of people asking me, why don't you put some money where your mouth is? The last several years, I'm experimenting with higher education and lots of ideas, and I will mention to you what they are. And this is a prototype of trying those ideas. And you're welcome to take it apart, and I'm sure some of the panelists will do that. So I'll skip some of this. This is what I would like to start with. I have a dream, I said, that I would like to start a zero tuition university which will guarantee the jobs to the student. And that is not easy. And this is a quotation I'm using, not Dr. Martin Luther's quotation, but Mandela's quotation, how significant the education is in one's lifetime. He said, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And as you know, today, we are celebrating in South Africa the passing away of Mandela. So I'm proposing a paradigm shift. When you ask education person, who is the customer of your institution? 80% of the time, they will say, student is my customer. You say, why? Because he pays the tuition. However, I believe the real customer of an university is the corporation or the employer. Not just the corporation, because the government is a major employer, the employer. So I'm proposing that we start with this change in paradigm. We say, who is the customer? It is the employer and not the student. And a couple of things come up in the architecture of Inquirsity proposal I have. Hands-on teaching, learning by doing. And everybody in this audience will agree that teaching occurs the best when you do read and study theory and do practicals. I'm proposing that our faculty be a dual hat faculty. Not only they teach, but also they do small R and big D. Earlier, I think I had a discussion with some of you here. What is the role of faculty? Should it be doing more research or more teaching? And I'm proposing small R and big D. D is a development, designing products and solutions. There should be incubators. Not only we want the students to be job seekers, but we want them to be the job creators. There has to be a strong partnership with corporation. That was touched upon earlier, and I'm proposing it should be very, very strong. Now, being a techie, everything I believe has to be technology driven. Everything. What we are talking today in the conference is just touching the surface in my view. But some of the ideas I heard are going to be, everything will be transformed by technology. And act as a company. Think of sources of revenue, think of the top line, and think of the bottom line. Very few presidents, and I have many friends as university president, they think like this. However, there are many of them also think like this. But we want the entire industry to think along that line. So here is a simple idea of this Inquirsity. Currently, how am I going to get a zero tuition entity? If you look at the budgets of the universities, 70%, as you heard some of the comments were made by the speaker, is done in the labor or the teaching function of the university. What I took the university and I broken it down to three major functions. One is the so-called admissions function, the other is the teaching function, and the last is sort of what they call it the career services. Look at the budgets, roughly they get 20%, 70%, 10%. And I looked at a lot of budgets. However, there is a great variation, but this is overall is what you see. Then what I'm proposing in the university, the other way around. 20% for the admissions you keep it, but you cut it down the teaching function from 70% to 40%. And put that money of 30% into career services. Teach the students to be innovators, to job seekers, but the best at their job, and be ready that they get out of the college. Now, revenue comparisons. If you look into the traditional universities, and there is a variation in the private sector, public sector, government funded, non-government funded and all that. On the average, 50% of the revenue comes from tuition. And other functions like government grants, endowments, royalties and all that. So what I'm proposing, that the 50% of the revenue of the university comes from selling products and services. If I cannot do that, then there is no way I can do the 0% tuition institution, correct? Now there has been a discussion, I think, Richard, when I asked this question in our panel, there was a question whether this can be legally done or not. Can you have an university that is focused toward doing that? But I can tell you there are models, one can answer it. But this is a totally different paradigm when you think of it. So how would we make this happen? And Deborah Smith this morning talked about it, and many of you are already doing it, that very, very tight partnership. Industry, academia, and the government. As Dr. Young said, the game changer for the US economic future is this tight integration. Now, just to give an idea how this thing evolved and where university is, as you heard earlier, I started almost 3 years ago, I think, when I saw the future of the education is going to be going online and blended learning. I started the College of Energy and Environment. That was a coincident of bridging nation journey from the prosperity triangle to the energy innovation triangle. First thing that time people said, oh, this is never going to happen. And so many university presidents, they would call me, oh, let me get the faculty to see if they can like this. And 100% of the time I got saying, no, we cannot do this. Now they are calling me to tell me, our governor, our state legislature have told us that they have to do online and blended learning education. Big change in 3 years. Then towards the focus, thinking of student as the product, we had to really make the students employable. Then I said, let me try and also getting them the job. So we have started a product called Career Folio. It's an online portal that connects the student to the jobs. And so I'm experimenting with the idea with the college that every student comes out of the college will have a job before they leave this college. Very great schools like Harvard, MIT and all that, they don't have that problem. But 60-70% of the universities, they might say something on their website, but I know that their students are unemployable. 80% of my interns come, they are full-time degree holders, and they don't have job, they're looking for a job. So my goal is to really bridge that gap and that last mile in higher education. And recently I just started an incubator as part of the college thing. So if all of us think of, look, the whole thing is, how do we, the panel focus is going forward, rebuilding or redesigning the whole higher education industry or economy. This is one of the models I'm proposing. I think the rest of the panelists can take it apart, add it, subtract it, whatever. So I will start here. Thank you very much again.
So we're going to do something a little bit different for this panel. Rather than just getting up and each of us speaking, try to have much more of a conversation and hopefully much more interaction with all of you throughout the whole process. For one, I've been to so many conferences over the years, and one of the things that always drives me crazy is you hear a lot of speeches and then the question is, okay, now what? Where do we go from here? So I would love to see us come up with a couple of specific insights that whether your institution or somebody else ends up taking on. So, what I thought I would do is just, quickly give the background of the folks that we have, just so you know who they are. You've got their bios. We don't have to talk much about that. I was going to pose just a couple of opening points and then really get into the conversation. I've spoken to each of the panelists to get some of the areas that they could add the most to the conversation. So Richard sits right next to me. Richard's got an amazing background as an entrepreneur, as an executive, as a venture capitalist. He's been around the sector for a long time, and we actually, yes. And so we have a connection in common which is Mr. Kaufman from Kansas City. He's got an amazing biotech and health sciences background and is involved with doing tech transfer in a fairly significant way. So I think he'll add a very interesting dynamic to this. Peter is with APLU, which is the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. I particularly loved his background because he's been both in the corporate world as the former chair of Dow Chemical, but is also Dow Jones. I knew it was Dow. And then also as president of a large university, Michigan State. So he's got a very interesting background. You all know Dr. P. As I was thinking about today, my comments kept changing in my head based upon what we were hearing. I'm overall a little bit skeptical of what has been happening in a lot of universities, because I think there's some wonderful universities and wonderful colleges and examples that are working all over the place, and many of them are the ones that end up coming to these kind of conferences. It's the thousands of other institutions, whether they're the small institutions or some of the community colleges. And again, within the community college, you've got some wonderful examples of ones that are doing amazing jobs, and you have a lot of them that are not. But then you also have, within any great university, programs that are in those universities that are just not necessarily delivering on the ultimate promise. And as I look at it, if I take, for example, the not-for-profit sector as a whole, I think there's probably 2/3 to 3/4 too many not-for-profits. There's 1.5 million of them. In essence, what I've always said in that sector is you've got, huge global problems trying to be taken on by corner grocery stores. There's very little collaboration, very little scale amongst most organizations, and I think it applies very much the same way to the education system. You've got a lot of small places that are very siloed, and I think generally are not dealing with the real problems and the real issues, which is focusing on, as Dr. P had said, preparing students for employment and prosperity. I thought that was a great statement, because they are the ultimate customer, and they are the product. And when I've used the word product at a college that I'm on the board of, the professors had a nervous breakdown. Because I think that most colleges, I've actually heard people say, and I love the saying, is that many colleges are run by the insane, and the insane being the professors. They do what they want. This whole concept of tenure, personally, I think is a joke. I don't think it should exist. And I just think it's run its course as to why it was first there. Too many professors are teaching too few courses. The economics of the system is really broken. As we've come in to save a bunch of universities, the things that you would find when you walk in is just scary about what the economics are, and the number of courses being offered and how they're not aligned to really anything other than the fact that it's an area that a professor happened to be interested in. And so, I think we've got a lot of challenges that we need to talk about. When we talk about, technology, to me, this whole concept of STEM is so critical for lots of reasons. One is it's not just about the technology itself. For us as a society to be part of the conversation, the democracy, you can't do that unless you are science literate, unless you're STEM literate. Because the things that are going on in Washington and in our states are so driven, whether it's in the nuclear conversation, the clean tech or environmental conversations, the medical conversations, unless you understand what's being discussed, how can you possibly take part in the conversation? The other part is that we live in a world today, and more so as we go forward, where technology is part of every aspect of our life, whether it's being able to use a cell phone to make a phone call, or you're having a conversation with your doctor, or you're just trying to deal with all the other electronics that permeate our world. Unless you understand the basics of the STEM arena, I don't understand how people can survive today and be able to thrive. And if you go back to the conversation that somebody was bringing up about, K6 and really K8, one of the travesties at that level is that the vast majority of the people who are teaching our students have absolutely no background or expertise in science. So how can they possibly be expected to both be passionate about it and deliver the kind of knowledge? So I think that for all those, the question ultimately on this was, if you look at the title of this, to repair or tear down, I think that's a really interesting conversation that should happen, and something that I hope we're able to take on today. So, some of the questions that I want to be able to pose is, does education begin and end at universities? From the kind of post-secondary side, what is education? What is the role of the higher education institutions? What should the cost be? Should it be free and come up with a new, model like Dr. P was talking about, or is there some other models that should exist? And then ultimately, the big question in my mind is, what % of the population should participate? Right now it's really a scary number. With 50% approximately who actually enroll in some level in higher ed, and around half or a little over half of them ever get some form of a degree, it means that the majority of the population is not getting any sort of a degree. And what does that really mean, going back to what Deborah said this morning, and I agree wholeheartedly, that if we look out over the next 10 years, we're going to see whole job classifications continue to get wiped away because of technology advances. And I spend my whole life really digging into what those technologies are, and they're amazing, but they have a significant impact on what type of jobs are going to exist. And the whole bottom, when you see robots walking along fields, picking, both picking crops, but also first picking out, the weeds that are coming up that used to be laborers doing that type of thing. What does that mean? When you have driverless cars, it's a real impact. And I don't think that we as a country are dealing with that. So today we talked a lot about technology and MOOCs and the Coursera's and Udacity's and the competency-based learnings, the University Now and online education and continuous learning, Udemy and other wonderful models. So I want to talk, turn to my panelists and really start first with Peter, who's dealing a cross-section of these universities. What role should the traditional higher ed model, the universities, the colleges, the community colleges, the institutes play in the education of our citizens? And what is that reasonable participant rate for those types of institutions?
Well, in the spirit of our small group and participatory session, let me just say I thought your sweeping condemnation was exactly that. Wasn't sufficiently nuanced. The issues are much more intricate than you suggest, actually. It seems to me that right now the figures in the country is about 41% of the working age population have some kind of degree. Many people, including the President and some others, I am strongly supportive of this, Lumina, Gates, and others, believe at least by 2025 there should be about 60%, in keeping with Canada, South Korea, some other places. We need that. I believe it's been helpful to have the for-profit institutions rise and be competitive. They, in fact, certainly don't compete on price, but they have competed on convenience, accessibility, and I think that's been good, and I think it's pushing other people, not just to community colleges, but many four-year institutions. I think that's excellent, actually. Now, I do believe that there are some ways to hold all institutions, for-profits and the publics, community colleges, more to account. My association is basically all the big publics in the country, virtually every one of them in the land grants. It's in Michigan, it's Michigan and Michigan State, it's Purdue and Indiana, the Cal system, so on and so forth, and all the land grant schools. Now, I think for our institutions, as well as for-profits, etc., there ought to be public data available that we all report. One is on unemployment. Currently, we don't have the capacity to report employment. I can tell you, when I tried to pull together this data at Michigan State, I was there 11 years actually, it was impossible to do accurately. We need the federal government through Social Security, IRS, or something to have this data. Congress ought to amend the law to allow the Department of Education to do this. I think we also need a graduation rate that works. My organization, plus the other presidential associations in Washington, have now worked together with the clearinghouse, which I won't get into what it is, but essentially we're now able to find the data for most institutions that not only first-time, full-time, which iPads provides, but also transfers in and out. There's a website set up now for this, look it up, it's student achievement measurement. Institutions are now able to put up their data, big push, but that's the kind of data we need. We've always, the first-time, full-time of iPads was hasn't been accurate for 20 years anyway, since there's so many transfers in and out. I think that, plus I think the loan repayment. I don't like the use of default because it's too unsophisticated. As we know, when you default, you're really deep in, but we bankers all know you can look at loan repayments, late payments and so forth, and get an accurate earlier picture. I think those three things, plus some others like average debt of those who have debt, etc. There's a small group of data which, if they were available, it's not only to the students that you need to have this data available, it's to the institutions. Institutions need to drive, their behavior needs to, we know that last information is 87.9% of the people that go to college say their primary goal is a job. So you got to have the job data out there. It's not the only thing though. I mean, when a student came to Michigan State, we expected to broaden that perspective. We expected to teach them how to learn. There's a whole bundle of things that will both improve, we think, the quality of life, that's judgmental of course, improve their quality of life, but as well as give them the capacity to adjust for jobs. The job training skill thing is very good, you need to do it. But we have to realize it's not just the first job we're looking at. Now, some parts of the big publics and the big universities are very career-oriented. I mean, the accountants, the engineers, many of the STEM other fields, etc. But others like history, social science, I don't want to stop teaching history, that's for sure. but I would expect that we should measure and report the kinds of learning outcomes such as analytical thinking, capacity to write, so forth. The regional publics, which is an organization called ASCU and EPLU, the big publics, have worked together for several years on something called the Voluntary System Accountability. There are 300 institutions out of about 500, so it's not everybody, have been reporting this kind of information. Now, there's no way not to deal with the current establishment. I mean, the big publics educate the huge portion of four-year degrees in this country. And the question is, how do we have them be particularly responsive to in questions like jobs, like hire more learning or training. I asked the question before the last panel of, okay, jobs, tenured faculty members, and I'm not prepared to take on tenure. I got to tell you that right now. I may change the definition some, but that's a battle that is not worth doing, in my view. It's gradually changing in some regards, but there is some problem with a dissident, wild idea that 20 years from now is conventional. And there's ways maybe to redefine tenure some, but it has some strength. And besides, it's taking on the UAW in Michigan.
So Peter, how would you get to 60 from the 40%?
I know the vote just occurred in Michigan on right to work law, but notice the UAW is still there.
Over the next 11 years, going from 41 to 60, right, and basically an increase in 50%, when you look at it from a budgetary standpoint and also from a current institution and infrastructure standpoint, how do you foresee closing that gap in such a short period of time?
Well, the numbers have grown quite a lot. In the last 10 years, there's a 28% increase in public university students. 10 years, 28%. I think the numbers, they were going up during the recession. They've now dropped some in the last year, the overall numbers. But frankly, to not have a degree in this country is a recipe to not much of anything. And I think you ask parents whether they have an education or not, a degree or not, they say, my kid ought to get a degree. Now we have to make, and I think the jobs out there in a more complex society require more sophistication. And I think a degree is the best way to do this, but I'm not satisfied. I'm regarded as a bit of a rebel of my structure, as I certainly was at Michigan State. I'm not satisfied that the big publics or the for-profits or the community colleges are doing enough. And I see some places are wonderfully responding and others not so much.
But do you think, I mean, do you believe that number is achievable?
Yeah, by 25.
11 years.
11 years, I think.
Does anybody out there believe that that's possible?
It is, because what we're doing is, if the college going rate doesn't increase one bit, and we begin to increase retention, the students who will come to us, if we begin to graduate them,
There, she's right. See,
that's how we can do it.
a big chunk of
We don't even have to increase the numbers of students going to college. We just have to increase the numbers who get out.
But do the institutions, do they have the current focus and leadership to do that?
Well, there are a bunch of them. I mean, you look at places
We're
like
talking about
Arizona.
millions of people we gotta add.
Well, but that's okay. This is wise, and I'm happy to see the First Lady talk about this a couple weeks ago, and the indication of the White House she's going to make a bigger sustained effort. I don't say it's the only thing, but I look at places like Georgia State, like Arizona State, a number of schools, and those numbers are moving.
Richard, what do you think of it?
Well, I have a different perspective that I'm going to come from, and based on the theme of repair or tear down. And I think, first of all, I think there's a disconnect between the academic institutions and who the true customer is. And when you say, is it the employer or is it the student? And I think that's where really there's a disconnect, because I learned some statistics today. First of all, if I characterize myself, I'm a late blooming millennial who has a PhD in gigs, okay? Because when you listen to those statistics, that the average when I was growing up, I was going to have 7 jobs in my career. That grew to 13, okay, over a lifetime. What I hear today, it's 4 job, a new job or career every 4 years. But if you're going to do gigs, you're going to have 10 different jobs or careers by the time you're 40, which means you might have 20 by the time you decide to retire, if you ever retire, and people are not retiring today. So what I'm thinking today is there's a disconnect in what is needed for employers to educate the students to meet their needs, and for the students to meet what's going to happen to their careers and not get very good counseling about what they need to study or the career path they should take to be prepared to go into 10 different jobs over the next 20 years. Because the skills are changing, the paradigm's changing, and technology is changing so rapidly that even the professional STEM jobs are changing so rapidly that they have to get retrained every year or every 2 years because of the evolution of technology. So at the end of the day, how do you respond as an academic institution? It's like an aircraft carrier trying to make a quick turn in the ocean. You have so much infrastructure, overhead, bureaucracy, silo mentality that it's very hard to change and become entrepreneurial with your academic institutions in the way that they need to respond to the market. So, what would I do today? If I would look at an academic institution as a business, it is an unbelievable business. I've created a new nonprofit in Maryland, and I have Johns Hopkins, Ron Daniels, president, and I have Britt Kerwin, the chancellor of the University System of Maryland, on my board. Well-known educators, totally different dynamics. Johns Hopkins is a $10 billion enterprise. It's an extremely large business. But at the end of the day, who's the customer? Sometimes I think the customer is the dean. There's a total lack of focus on the company outside or the student because you're having to patronize the deans within the departments within the academic institutions who are not connected in the way that they should be to the ultimate customer, which are the companies and sometimes the students at the end of the day. So I would focus, if you're going to do a business plan for an academic institution, number one, you have to determine what is the market, who is your primary customer, and what are the market needs. And then after doing that, you identify what your assets are within your institution to determine whether or not you have the assets to meet the market needs. And I think we have a Silicon Valley syndrome. Whether it's MOOCs or anything else that's emerging in education, everybody has to have one. So when I go talk around the world about innovation ecosystems, everybody wants to take a plane trip to Silicon Valley or they want to take a plane trip to Boston. What they need to do is get on a plane and go to Kansas City, Missouri or Kansas or go to Cleveland, Ohio. Because the average institutions there have to deal with the traditional students and the traditional population and the traditional careers versus those things that we see at MIT, Stanford, and Harvard in those environments, because those are not they're artificial environments for what the average student's going to see, the average academic president's going to have to live in that environment. They are so much the exception. So at the end of the day, what would I do? I would go back and say, it's not tear it down, but there has to be a significant amount of reinvention, and each institution can't be all things to all people. You have to decide who your customer is, determine where the niches are, where you can excel, have a differential advantage, have a proprietary thing that you do better than those people that you feel that you compete with, and you're probably not competing with Harvard or MIT or Stanford. You're competing with somebody else in your region that is offering similar types of curriculum where the employers are hiring people in the same types of job classifications. So when I think of gigs, though, what I really like about gigs is there's very few institutions in the country that really do co-ops, like Northeastern and Drexel. I think if you look at the future, to give students exposure to what kind of a career that they would want to get into, I think we need to expand the co-op program way beyond just a traditional internship program. I think getting students as early involved in their freshman years or senior in high schools doing co-ops in industry and experiencing 4 or 5 different things as they're going through helps them better prepare for what they're going to do when they come out. Also, it prepares them because they're going to probably end up in one or two of those careers if they're going to have 10 different gigs over the next 20 years after they graduate. And I just came up with a term, and I didn't realize what it is, but externship. Is there a term, externship? Yeah. Okay, well, it's a new one to me, and I thought I just created it, but thank God it's already in existence. The reason is because we just had a graduate from the University of Maryland. She wasn't sure what she wanted to do. So we have a number of interns in our organization, but she's a college graduate, which is not traditional for interns, but she wants to experiment and expose to things that she would like to go into. And I think that's another good thing for students to look at. How do you prepare them to go work somewhere before they have to actually take a real job, to go into their career? Give them that experiential learning by being involved with a company or an organization after they've developed some of these skills to see if they can be applied or where they can be applied most effectively.
So Richard, one of the things that I heard you say, and I've seen when my college that I went to was Syracuse,
right?
And I created the entrepreneurship major there way back when, and I've gone through lots of iterations of arguments there because I've tried to point out that entrepreneurship. Typically, entrepreneurs don't come out of business schools. They're science and arts type people who have these incredible ideas and create innovation that then launch businesses. And so I've tried to push the entrepreneurship programs out into the computer science and engineering and other programs. And one of the big stumbling blocks that I run into all the time is the whole fight for credit hours that exists within a lot of the schools. My daughter, who's now a freshman at USC, and she's in the theater program, I sat with the dean of the theater school, and we had a long conversation about the fact that these kids are coming out and they really need to have some business skills and they really need to understand entrepreneurship. And the bottom line is there's no room in the program, but when you really dig in, and she became very honest with me, because of the way the credit hour fight goes on within the school and who gets credit, it's just not possible to add these kind of things. So I'd love to hear you guys in terms of structurally. I think we're talking about some very interesting things, but how, if we don't break and tear down some of the way the system works, how do we start solving some of these problems?
I'd just like to comment first on the tenure thing, related to this culture change. I'm focused heavily on tech transfer and commercialization, and that's what we do. We help commercialize, whether it's from a university, a federal lab. We extract technologies out of corporations that are non-progressed assets, find ways to create new businesses and create jobs for the graduates. Or the question is, when you talk about the customer, is the student the employer? I mean, is the employer the customer, or does the student become the employer themselves because of the entrepreneurial nature of what they're going to be? And so, Rick Kerwin, which I'm sure you know very well, at the University System of Maryland, they have one of the worst technology transfer programs in the United States within their university system, of which they have 13 universities, 3 of them primarily involved in research. And they made a decision that they wanted to create 325 new companies over the next 10 years out of their institutions. Well, how are you going to do that when you don't have the faculty incentivized to want to do that, or to get involved in intellectual property, creation of patents, creation of startups, and doing licensing? What they did was they changed a year ago the tenure track to where intellectual property and patents and startups will go and count towards tenure. So it's not eliminating tenure, it's how do you modify the tenure track to incentivize people to be more aligned with the goals of your institution or the market or your customers so that they can become more aligned. So I don't think you have to throw away the whole tenure track. The question is, how do you reinvent tenure to be aligned with the academic institution's goals to meet the customer needs, whether it be the student or the employers you're trying to create jobs for, or those people you're trying to transfer technologies to get new things into the marketplace.
Dr.
I think that there are a number of nuances that need to take place. This tenure track issue of patents and commercialization is in fact a topic of conversation I had among 13 presidents just a few weeks ago that represented the big research. I think it needs to be done. I think there's a lot of sophisticated and not so sophisticated nuances that we should try. I think that over and above that, these big institutions, like any big institution, needs to have some relatively clear goals that help drive everything along. I think the employment and graduation rate goals, with all that it implies, is a good. Let me give you an example. It's not quite as grand. When I got to Michigan State in '93, we decided that we were going to be one of the best, the largest number of study abroad places in the country. And we made a commitment after much discussion, faculty nature. I was very much the driver of this, but that by 2006, 40% of our graduates would have a study abroad experience. At that time, we were 700 students, which was about 15%, 10 actually. And we did it. And I didn't prescribe to every faculty member or every department how we're going to achieve that, but I pounded away on going to achieve this. Used the football game advertisements, you know, that little media you have, we pushed away. And I'll bet you if you ask some of the academic folks here what they know about Michigan State, it's likely to be that study abroad program, at least one of the things. Maybe being Ohio State would be one of the other. But I think this idea, we have to report employment. We have to, and I'll tell you, if my accounting department at Michigan State knew what their employment numbers were as graduates, and if they didn't have virtually every student have a job about a degree, it was a source of embarrassment to me. Now, those are career, the same thing with College of Education, engineering and so forth. Now, we've got to broaden that beyond that. I think that you can look at the nuances, which is key, like the tenure track, but there's